Okay, folks, welcome back. We are getting close to the end of Module 0 and kind of our preparatory information from the course. And we're going to start talking a little bit more about the structure of the material itself and how to approach it. This is a really important lecture because we talk about the tips for succeeding in what is oftentimes a difficult class for a lot of people. And that's going to prominently feature a system that I've kind of woven into things called my POE and FFS system. So start at the beginning, talk a little bit about statistics in general. So a lot of people find statistics to be intimidating to an extent. They can think that the concepts are too abstract. There's a tendency to think, statistics is all about just mushing numbers together, which is certainly a big part of what happens, but it all kind of lays on this framework of these underlying abstract concepts that talk about things in generalities, like talking very generically about variables and scores and a lot of the terms you'll hear very early on. There is an element of the course that requires you to calculate things. That's why we have a calculator. So you are going to be doing some mushing of numbers together. The calculation is relatively straightforward, especially as long as you can handle the algebra type calculations that you're going to need to do and you can approach the formulas correctly. But still, that's something that some people aren't comfortable with. You are also going to need to apply the concepts that you learn. This is not a course about memorization and regurgitation. This is a course about using that framework I mentioned to approach different problems involving data, to know how to appropriately draw conclusions from the information that you have. And finally, describe the course as being partly in English and partly in what you call statisticese. There is a lot of jargon and terminology that gets kind of folded into this. There's also, of course, our ever-present formulas that have various symbols that you have to understand and remember, and put it all together, and people sometimes feel kind of overwhelmed by the whole thing. These aren't real formulas for the class. That's a little more than what we'd be doing. So again, some of the concepts can seem relatively easy at first, but we tend to build towards things that are a little bit less straightforward. So what I want to do in this video and in a lot of the others is try and prepare you for the mindset that you're going to want to have and the approach that you're going to want to take to make sure that you minimize the amount of struggling that you have. The first thing I'll tell you is you will struggle. There's a percentage of students who find statistics super intuitive and easy to get through. They are a small minority. The vast majority of students will have difficulty. It's a matter of when you have the difficulty, how kind of pronounced it is, and then most of it is just how do you approach that. So expect to run into a wall of comprehension issues at some point, and really think, what am I going to do to make sure that that wall happens as infrequently as possible, that it's as low as possible, and how am I going to get over it when I get there? But you are going to have those moments pretty much no matter what. So there is hope. Again, it's a course that you can get through. Every student, whether they like the sort of stuff we talk about or not, whether they like the process of research or not, you can get through the class. Everyone is capable of doing this. Maybe more difficult for some students than others, but everyone can do it. So here's some general tips for how to do well in the class. Remember, this is probably your first time taking it. Maybe it's your second if you've had a bad experience. I've taught this class probably about 30 times now. So I've seen a lot of students come through the doors. I've seen what works. I've seen what doesn't work. The first thing you want to do in an online class is make sure you can take the class. You need to confirm your access. Make sure all of your equipment works as soon as possible. One of the easy ways to add unnecessary stress is to get to a point when time's kind of running out, you need to start taking exams, and suddenly there's some technical problems, things don't work the way that they need to. There is an online student success guide in the Module 0 folder. It will give you some information like your resources, your links to tech support and course sites. That's also in your technical resources folder. Just general tips for doing well in online classes, kind of generically or generally. A little more targeted towards the course, stay engaged with what's going on. Especially with difficult material, it can be easy to kind of zone out when you're watching videos and no one's there to make sure you're paying attention. It can be easy to get distracted, look at other stuff, mess around with your phone. You want to make sure you stay engaged with the material so that you can, as much of it can sink in as possible every time. You want to get the most bang for your buck in terms of the hours that you're going to devote towards this class. So certainly view the lecture videos, read the chapters in the book, engage in those discussion forums I've shown you in earlier forums, ask questions to me directly during office hours, via video, via email. Keep up with your homework and assignments. Again, everything isn't due until the very end. You Do not want to put yourself in the boat where you're trying to do 80% of the work in 20% of the semester. That's a recipe for disaster. Instead, what you really probably want to try to do is get like 30% of the work done in the first 20% of the semester and kind of try to ride that wave and stay ahead of the schedule a little bit. You really want to put your head down, especially in week 1 and week 2, and get as much progress as you possibly can in the course to give yourself the most time possible. There are lots of places where extra practice is available. There are practice quizzes at the end of every single module. There are extra homework assignments and problems that aren't graded that you can do. There is even more in the ebook itself within the actual chapters. So those things are there for you to use them for students who are having problems to get extra repetitions. Take advantage. This one's tricky in online classes, but you want to work with other people whenever possible. Certainly with me, but with other students as well. Talking to other students about concepts is something that can help you understand them better than maybe me just trying to explain it a bunch of times in a row might, especially if you're trying to teach another student how things work or what a concept means. Remember, there are forums set aside for this. You also, if you know people in the class, you can exchange contact information. It's a really good idea to study socially as much as possible. Socially distantly maybe, but socially. Try to actively engage with the material. Don't just fall into that trap of I'm going to study and that means I'm going to reread the chapters 3 times in a row, and by the second time your eyes are glazed over and nothing's really sinking in. That's an inefficient use of time. That's kind of trying to brute force it. So try to engage with the material. Try to think your way through the material. Think about how I've talked about things, what I seem to emphasize. Think about applications, examples of how the material would work in the real world is something that we'll emphasize. Keep your head above water. If you fall behind early, either due to understanding issues or just due to kind of procrastination, you put yourself behind the 8 ball. It's hard to catch up. Make sure that you understand those early concepts as thoroughly as possible. This course continually builds on early concepts. Look around you, and what I mean is not just your room or wherever you're sitting, but look around the world around you. Statistics, empirical research is everywhere. Look at how it's used and how it's reported outside of class material. Where can you find people using statistics? Are they using them well? Are they using them poorly? Where do you find reporting on scientific research? And again, look at how that's structured, and that can kind of help bring some of this stuff to life when it's not just a really generic term, it's a specific example of it. Your first extra credit assignment, in fact, is going to be to get an outside example of how statistics are used in the real world and report on it. This is not a math class. This one's a little bit tough for people to process sometimes because they think statistics is math. You will be doing calculations in this class. There is some mathematical stuff, but really it's a conceptual class that's about the process of research, and specifically the part of research where we design a good study, we get good data from it, and then what do we do with that data to make sense of it? So that's that whole conceptual framework that I talked about earlier, making the best sense we can of the information that we have. There's a huge emphasis on that. Sometimes students don't expect that. They think they're just going to be punching things into a calculator the whole semester. That is a part of it, but it's mostly a part of it that's there to illustrate the conceptual stuff. Conceptual stuff is more important. It will typically be worth more points on your exams and quizzes. And this one kind of flies in the face of the other ones. Don't get cocky. What do I mean by that? Well, what you'll find is that the early modules may seem really basic. Here is something from, I think it is module 3. It's in the first unit. We're going to calculate an average. Okay, we take all the scores that we got, we add them up, we divide by the number of scores. You probably learned how to do this in junior high, if not elementary school. Calculating an average is not new. It's real easy to look at this and be kind of your eyes glaze over, like, ah, this is kiddie stuff. But what you'll find is that when we talk about the mean, we talk about how to calculate it, but we also talk about how it relates conceptually to some of the bigger issues, like using small sets of scores to draw conclusions about big sets of scores we didn't measure. There's a lot of conceptual stuff interwoven in that, but either way, flash forward, half a dozen modules or so, and we start looking at things like this. This is probably very inscrutable to you. It's very hard to make sense of. That's fine. You're not supposed to get what this means, at the beginning of the session, but the transition from this to this is a little subtler and smoother than you might expect, and it's very easy. If you're a little bit lost on a Monday, you might be totally lost by a Friday. So you want to be very wary and mindful of that process. Pay attention to those points when you kind of when you mostly get things, but there's elements that you don't get. You really want to attend to that instead of waiting until it's looks like total gibberish and you're failing exams, and again, you are giving yourself more of an uphill climb than you need to. One last one, you want to keep up with the plot of the course. There's less to understand than there is to remember, and that's the sort of thing where you're like, what the heck, what does that mean? It sounds like a fortune cookie thing. What I mean is this. There is a consistent narrative theme in the class of what we are trying to do. And again, it's that same idea of designing a really good study, which we talk about a little bit, but not a lot. We talk a lot about when you get information, data from that study, here's what you do with it, how you make sense of it, and how you apply it. Most students that I've talked to that struggle in the class and wind up doing well describe having some kind of a click moment. And the click moment almost always involves realizing there's only really like 4, 5, maybe 6 major concepts that are happening, and they're just showing up over and over again in different forms as ways of making sense of different research designs and different studies. So really look for those consistent underpinnings and themes. If you can master and grasp the basic conceptual framework of what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it and how we approach it, it becomes far easier. The back half of the semester is almost entirely what are called hypothesis tests, ways of testing hypotheses. There's one process for hypothesis testing. It lays on a foundation of lots of concepts, but then we pretty much just do that same process and apply it to just different research situations. If you understand why we're doing what we're doing, it's easier to apply that framework to new situations. If you don't, you sometimes fall into that trap of trying to brute force memorize your way through things, and that really has a very limited shelf life. It doesn't work for very long. So here's how I help you keep up with the plot. Through those POEs and FFSs, I try to make sure that it's clear what the most important concepts are, because there's oftentimes a lot of things going on. It's hard to know which one of these things are really central to what we're talking about, which ones are more peripheral or kind of secondary or mini little tangents that will go on sometimes. So at some points during my videos, I'm going to pause and label some things points of emphasis, or a POE. These are things that are especially important for you to understand, that are really, really meaningful to what we're trying to do. In addition, practically, points of emphasis also helps you highlight things that I am almost certainly going to ask you about in graded material. On an exam, pretty much every point of emphasis will be on there. On a quiz, I got to be a little more selective. But generally, these are the things that your grade will disproportionately be based on. Any kind of calculation or formula you can call a point of emphasis. Again, you are not going to memorize any formulas, but we emphasize working with data, and you need to understand which formulas are appropriate and how to interpret them, how to apply them. Some items, especially early in the session, will be labeled as for future service, FFS. And what that means is that this is something that isn't super essential right now, but it's going to be important later on. Usually that means later in the course. Once in a while, especially late on, I'll say, hey, I just want you to be familiar with this in case you go to graduate school. You're going to see a lot more of this stuff. We're not going to really talk about it in our class. So those things are things that aren't necessarily important right now, but are going to be very important later on. For now, when they show up, they're a little less likely than a point of emphasis to be graded, but show up in graded material, but they are going to be important later, and today's FFS is probably next week's point of emphasis. It's going to come up again later on. A few items are so important that I give them both labels. They are things that are important at the moment, but also are just crucial building blocks to the data analysis procedures we're trying to learn. So pay doubly close attention to those. What I will say is you can and will be graded on anything that we cover in class. Point of emphasis, the for future service are just things that are especially emphasized, but there will be stuff that you'll be graded on that won't be either of them. One thing I will tell you, if the book covers something and we don't, you're not going to be graded on that. I'm only going to grade you on the things that I talked to you about. So general questions, if you have them, you can post them to the discussion forum. You can send me emails. You can set up office hours. For now, I've been talking long enough on this one, I think, but this is a really important lecture, and hopefully it'll help you get into that successful mindset that we want all of you to have. All right, next we are going to wrap things up with our very last video, the big ideas, that's going to set things up for our actual course content.